Imagine a place that once pulsed with the heartbeat of an entire empire. A city within a city where 30,000 souls gathered every morning to forge the very identity of a nation. This was Longbridge. In its prime, it wasn't just a factory, it was a cathedral of industry. It was where Great Britain proved to the world that it could out-engineer, out-build, and out-dream anyone on the planet. But today, the silence is deafening. The empire is gone. The name Austin, a name once synonymous with reliability, luxury, and British grit, has been wiped from the face of the earth. How does a company go from producing the most iconic car in history, the Mini, to becoming a national joke? How do you lose $1 billion, an entire workforce, and a century of heritage? This isn't just a story about cars, it's a story of ego, betrayal, and a series of catastrophic decisions that turned a titan into a ghost. If you want to understand how a superpower loses its way, you have to look at the rise and fall of the Austin Motor Company. Our story begins in 1905, but not in a boardroom. It starts with a man who had just been kicked out of his own creation. Herbert Austin was a brilliant, stubborn engineer who had built the Wolseley Company into a powerhouse, only to be shown the door by directors who didn't share his fire. Herbert didn't wallow. He moved to a small, derelict printing works in a village called Longbridge. People thought he was crazy. It was 7 miles from the city, surrounded by nothing but muddy fields. But Herbert saw something they didn't. He saw space. Space to build the biggest factory the world had ever seen. By 1906, the first Austin car rolled out. It wasn't for the common man, not yet. These were carriages for the elite. Grand Dukes of Russia, bishops, and British nobility were his first customers. Austin was the motor for the magnificent. But then, the world caught fire. 1914, World War I begins. Most companies would shrink in fear, but Austin exploded. He pivoted from luxury cars to shells, aircraft, and heavy artillery. His workforce went from 2,000 to 20,000 almost overnight. He was a patriot, taking on government contracts at razor-thin margins. By the time the guns fell silent in 1918, Herbert Austin was a knight of the realm, Sir Herbert Austin. He had the biggest factory in Europe and a massive trained workforce. He was ready to conquer the world of peace. But he made one fatal mistake. He assumed the world hadn't changed. Post-war Britain was broke. No one wanted 20-horsepower luxury land yachts anymore. Austin's massive factory was a curse. The overhead was eating him alive. By 1921, the company was in receivership. The banks were at the door. The dream was minutes away from being sold for scrap. Legend has it Herbert Austin stood in his office, took a coin from his pocket, and flipped it. Heads, they keep fighting. Tails, they close the gates forever. It landed on heads, but he needed a miracle. He needed a car that was so small, so cheap, and so revolutionary that it would force every Briton to stop walking and start driving. The baby that saved a giant. In 1922, the Austin Motor Company was a corpse waiting for a funeral. They were broke, their factory was too big, and their cars were too expensive. Sir Herbert Austin knew he needed a miracle, but his board of directors, the suits in the mahogany offices, didn't believe in miracles. They wanted to play it safe. So, Herbert did something radical, something that would be corporate treason today. He didn't design his next car in the factory. He went home. He retreated to the billiard room of his mansion, Lickey Grange, and recruited an 18-year-old draftsman named Stanley Edge. Working in total secrecy, away from the prying eyes of the board who thought the project was a waste of money, they began to sketch the Austin 7. The goal was simple: build a car for the man who thought he could only afford a motorcycle and a sidecar. When the Austin 7, nicknamed the Chummy, was finally unveiled, the critics laughed. It was tiny. It looked like a motorized pram. People joked that you didn't get into an Austin 7, you put it on. But the laughter stopped when the orders started pouring in. At just 165 pounds, it wasn't just a car, it was freedom. For the first time, the British middle class could go wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted. It was the motor for the millions. But here's the twist that most people forget. The Austin 7 didn't just save Austin, it built the world. Did you know that the first BMW ever built was actually a licensed Austin 7? Did you know that the first Nissan, then Datsun, was a copy of an Austin 7? Even in America, the American Austin Car Company paved the way for the original Jeep. Longbridge wasn't just a factory anymore, it was the epicenter of a global automotive earthquake. Success brings rivals, and Austin's greatest rival lived just 50 miles away in Oxford. His name was William Morris. If Austin was the refined engineer, Morris was the ruthless salesman. For the next 2 decades, these two titans engaged in a war of the roses on wheels. They slashed prices, they stole each other's engineers, and they fought for every inch of British tarmac. By the late 1930s, between the two of them, they controlled nearly 60% of the British car market. It was a golden age. Austin was the national pride. Every driveway in England seemed to have an Austin parked in it. But under the surface, the rot was already starting. 1939. For the second time in a generation, the world went to war. Once again, Longbridge shifted from cars to planes, building the legendary Ferry Battle and Sterling bombers. But this time, the cost was different. Sir Herbert Austin, the man with the vision, passed away in 1941. The captain was gone. The soul of the company was buried in a churchyard, while the factory he built was being bombed by the Luftwaffe. When the smoke cleared in 1945, Britain was a winner on paper, but a loser in the bank. The country was bankrupt. The government issued a chilling mandate to the car industry: export or die. Austin had to sell cars to America to bring in hard currency. But the Americans didn't want tiny baby Austins. They wanted chrome. They wanted size. They wanted power. Austin tried to pivot. They created the A40 Devon and the flashy A90 Atlantic, but they were competing with Detroit giants like Ford and Chevy. Then, in 1952, the unthinkable happened. The two archenemies, Austin and Morris, decided to stop fighting and get married. They merged to form BMC, the British Motor Corporation. It was supposed to be a powerhouse, a national champion to take on the world. Instead, it was the beginning of the end. Imagine two families who have hated each other for 30 years being forced to live in the same house. That was BMC. The Austin engineers at Longbridge hated the Morris engineers at Cowley. They refused to share parts. They refused to share secrets. They even had different cultures. Austin was seen as arrogant and technical. Morris was seen as cheap and commercial. They weren't fighting the Germans or the Americans anymore. They were fighting each other. In this fog of corporate war, a genius emerged, a man who would design a car so famous it would eclipse the company that built it, a car that would become the ultimate high before the ultimate crash. His name was Alec Issigonis, and his creation, the Mini, the Myth, and the Mutiny. 1959. The world was changing, and Austin was about to change with it. But it didn't happen because of a boardroom strategy. It happened because of a dictator in a fuel crisis. When the Suez Crisis hit in 1956, petrol was rationed. Britain was paralyzed. The massive, gas-guzzling Austins sitting in showrooms suddenly looked like dinosaurs. The head of BMC, Leonard Lord, looked at the tiny German bubble cars filling British streets, and he hated them. He famously said, "We must purge the streets of these pests. We will build a proper miniature car." He turned to a man named Alec Isigonis. Alec was a chain-smoking, brilliant, and notoriously difficult engineer who hated comfortable chairs and big trunks. He wanted efficiency. Isigonis did something no one had ever done. He turned the engine sideways and put the gearbox underneath it. He used rubber cones instead of springs for suspension. He saved so much space that 80% of the car's length was for passengers and luggage. When the Austin 7, later renamed the Mini, launched in 1959, it didn't just change car design, it shattered the British class system. Suddenly, the richest people in the world wanted the cheapest car in the world. Princess Margaret had one, Lord Snowdon had one, the Beatles had 4. It was the ultimate national pride. Austin was at the top of the world. But behind the glamour, there was a mathematical nightmare. Here is the secret the public didn't know. Austin was losing money on every single Mini they sold. Because of a massive accounting error, the Mini was priced too low. While it was selling in the millions, it wasn't filling the company's coffers, it was draining them. Austin was winning the culture war, but they were losing the business war. And then, the ghost that would eventually kill Austin began to haunt the factory floor. Longbridge was no longer just a factory, it had become a political battlefield. By the mid-1960s, the Austin way of doing things, paternalistic, top-down management, met the immovable object of organized labor. The shop stewards, led by legendary figures like Red Robbo, became more powerful than the factory managers. If a tea lady was fired, the whole line stopped. If a man was told to work a different machine, the whole plant walked out. Between 1960 and 1970, there were hundreds of wildcat strikes. Every time the machine stopped, the money vanished. Austin wasn't just fighting their rivals at Ford or Volkswagen anymore. They were at war with their own workers. And then, by 1968, the British government was terrified. If BMC, Austin and Morris collapsed, the British economy would sink. Their solution? The mega-merge. They forced BMC to merge with Leyland Motors, who owned Triumph and Rover. They called this new monster British Leyland. It was a disaster from day one. You had 40 different models, 70 different factories, and dozens of brands all competing for the same customers. It was like trying to win a race with 100 people all steering the same car in different directions. And in the middle of this chaos, Austin, the crown jewel, began to lose its luster. Quality dropped. The cars started to rust before they even left the showroom. The national pride was turning into a national embarrassment. But the worst was about to come. In a desperate bid to survive, Austin would release a car so catastrophically bad, so fundamentally flawed, that it would become the symbol of the company's death. It was called the Austin Allegro, and it was about to drive the company off a cliff. The square wheel of disaster. By 1973, the British car industry wasn't just sick, it was in the ICU. The newly formed British Leyland was a bureaucratic nightmare. It was a company run by committees who hated each other, funded by a government that didn't understand them, and staffed by workers who were perpetually on strike. Austin, once the gold standard of British engineering, was about to release its savior. It was supposed to replace the legendary 1100 and 1300 series. It was supposed to be modern, aerodynamic, and world-beating. Instead, they gave the world the Austin Allegro. The Allegro is often cited as the car that killed the British motor industry. But why? First, there was the look. It was dumpy. Because the engineers insisted on using a heater unit from a much larger car, the nose had to be puffed up like a bloated cheek. Then there was the quartic steering wheel. Yes, you heard that right, a square steering wheel. Austin's marketing team claimed it gave more legroom. The public claimed it was impossible to drive. It became the laughingstock of the nation overnight. But the square wheel was the least of their problems. The Allegro was so poorly engineered that if you jacked it up to change a tire, the body would flex so much that the rear window would literally pop out and shatter on the pavement. If you drove it through a car wash, the door seals would fail, soaking the passengers. Austin wasn't just building cars anymore, they were building punchlines. By 1975, the money ran out. British Leyland was officially bankrupt. The government had a choice: let it die and lose hundreds of thousands of jobs, or nationalize it. They chose to save it. They poured billions of taxpayers' pounds into the black hole of Longbridge. Austin was now the people's car company, but the people didn't want the cars. While the Japanese were perfecting the Toyota Corolla and the Honda Civic, cars that actually started in the morning and didn't rust in the rain, Austin was stuck in the past. Inside the Longbridge plant, a new king had risen. His name was Derek Robinson, better known to the press as Red Robbo. He was the ultimate shop steward. Between 1978 and 1979 alone, there were over 500 disputes at Longbridge. The factory was paralyzed. Management had lost all control. It was said that the workers didn't work for Austin, they worked for the union. Quality control became a myth. Stories circulated of workers leaving half-eaten sandwiches inside the door panels of cars, or accidentally dropping bolts into the engines out of spite. Austin, the national pride, was now the national embarrassment. In 1980, the company made one final desperate gamble. They needed a car to replace the aging Mini. They called it the Austin Metro. The launch was spectacular. It was billed as a British car to beat the world. And for a moment, just a brief, shining moment, it looked like it might work. The Metro was clever, fuel-efficient, and genuinely popular. Even Princess Diana drove one. It was the best-selling small car in Britain. Longbridge was buzzing again. But the clock was running out. The billions in debt were mounting. The reputation of the Austin badge was so poisoned by the 70s that no matter how good the Metro was, the shadow of the Allegro still hung over the showroom. Management realized they couldn't survive alone. They needed a partner who knew how to build cars that didn't break. They turned to the east. They turned to Honda. The rising sun and the death of a name. By 1980, Austin was a drowning man clutching at straws. The British government, now led by the formidable Margaret Thatcher, was losing patience. The black hole of Longbridge had swallowed enough taxpayer money. The ultimatum was clear: fix it or sell it. The fix came from an unlikely place: Japan. In a historic deal, Austin, now part of the renamed Austin Rover Group, partnered with Honda. The plan was simple. Honda would provide the engineering, the engines, in the legendary Japanese quality control. Austin would provide the factories and the British style. The first child of this marriage was the Austin Acclaim. For the first time in decades, an Austin-badged car actually worked. It didn't leak. The doors didn't fall off. It started every single morning. The critics were stunned. It was the most reliable car Austin had ever built, precisely because it was mostly a Honda. But there was a bitter irony here. By saving the company's bank account, they were destroying its soul. Austin was no longer a pioneer of engineering. It was a screwdriver plant, merely assembling someone else's genius. While Honda was fixing the cars, Margaret Thatcher was fixing the factory. She appointed a man named Sir Michael Edwardus to break the power of the unions. He didn't play games. He famously told the workers, "If you strike, I close the plant tomorrow." In 1982, Red Robbo was fired. The Wildcat strike stopped. The Red Fortress of Longbridge was finally under management control. Productivity soared. But for Austin, it was too little, too late. The damage to the brand's reputation, the decade of beige and broken, was irreversible. In the mid-1980s, the marketing gurus made a cold, calculated decision. They conducted surveys and found that the name Austin was associated with old men and flat caps, rust, and the square wheel Allegro. Meanwhile, another brand in their portfolio, Rover, was seen as classy, aspirational, and premium. In 1987, the unthinkable happened. The Austin name was officially killed off. The Metro, the Maestro, and the Montego cars that had been born as Austins were suddenly Rovers, or just M Group cars. After 82 years of history, the name that had powered the British Empire and put the world on wheels was deleted from the corporate register. The 90s brought one last hope. The British government sold the remains of the company to BMW. The Germans arrived at Longbridge with billions of marks and big plans. They were called the English Patient. BMW wanted to revive the spirit of Austin, but they didn't want the name. They wanted the Mini. For 6 years, BMW tried to fix the chaotic mess of Longbridge, but the culture clash was too great. The marriage from hell of the 50s was happening all over again, but this time with German efficiency versus British stubbornness. In 2000, BMW had enough. They divorced the company. They kept the Mini, the only truly valuable asset left, and sold the rest of the company to a group of 4 businessmen for just £10. The end came on a Tuesday in April. After 100 years, the money finally, truly ran out. 6,500 workers were sent home with no redundancy pay. The assembly lines that had built the Austin 7, the Spitfire engines, and the Mini simply stopped. The assets were sold to the Chinese company SAIC/Nanjing. They crated up the machines, put them on ships, and sent them to Asia. The national pride was now a national memory. Today, the Longbridge site is a shopping center and a housing estate. The only thing that remains of the Austin Motor Company is a few plaques and the memories of the men and women who gave their lives to the Austin. What is the lesson? Austin didn't die because of a bad car or a bad union. It died because it forgot how to evolve. It rested on its laurels while the world moved on. It traded its national pride for corporate ego and short-term survival. But next time you see a modern BMW Mini or a Nissan or even a BMW, remember this: they all have a little bit of Austin DNA in them. The company is gone, the name is dead, but the ghost of Herbert Austin's vision, that still drives on every road in the world. The empire is silent, but the story remains a warning to any giant who thinks they are too big to fail.